Today, we are reading the second half of Agustín Fuentes' Human Niche, Human Behavior, Human Nature, which is his examination of the extended evolutionary synthesis, which in some ways he did more in a theoretical way in the first 5 pages, which we already read. And in this second section, maybe a bit easier in the sense that he's looking at two cases. Case one, stone tools, and case two, warfare. And they're supposed to be about how the extended evolutionary synthesis better explains these crucial processes in human history than standard evolutionary models, which are important but need to be developed. So, with stone tools, we have talked about how, as humans, the Homo species, actually, we won't even necessarily talk about humans, as the Homo species begins to use stone tools, and we see these show up in the archaeological record at 2.5, 3 million years ago, even. Obviously, this provides new opportunities for transforming the landscapes and habitats in which the species and the different groups, maybe even different species lived. So in terms of niche construction, how creatures are able to change, modify their habitats, which then in turn can modify the conditions of selection for the next generation. And one of the things with tools is it develops new opportunities or new ways in which people learn. Actually, Cass, you talked about this a bit. Scaffolded learning. What's that?
That's like one person's learning is supported by the information that another person knows. It just kind of makes it pass through information from one person to another, and the way it grows over time.
Yeah, that's what we're supposed to be doing here in college, as opposed to those big places where they just blast you or you're watching videos all the time. Fuentes talks about this. I like the quote that you used, but there's a central role for behavioral inheritance and apprentice-style learning. That in order to make these tools, and we talked about how it's complex, they're harder to make than they look. And when we say stone tools, sometimes we think Flintstones and the Stone Age, and that must have been easy. It was not easy. We would not be able to do it, and I don't even try. But so what this leads to is that one person is actively teaching another person and transmitting or developing knowledge together. And so that you are then what you're getting not just an inheritance of biology or of genetics, you're getting that behavioral inheritance, which is being passed along and transformed from generation to generation. Now, Fuentes makes the additional argument that this does something to our brains. Ariana, what does it do to our brains? It helps them expand. Yeah, maybe some people argue that it literally does an expansion of the brain. I'm not sure about that based on some of the other creatures we've talked about who are able to use stone tools, but certainly it begins to transform the ways in which we use our neurons, our brain. Fuentes talks about this as a kind of feedback interaction or a feedback loop where one generation is teaching the next and you're growing and changing. And as that happens, it produces what Fuentes terms a language-ready brain, so that we're not necessarily. It's very difficult to discover evidence for language in the archaeological record until we get up to the stuff we talked about on Wednesday, writing seals and scripts. But certainly, there's good evidence that humans were using language at least 70,000 years ago, if not way further, and in some ways trying to transmit the techniques of tool construction from one generation to the other, and being able to transmit that over generations suggests pretty extensive communication and language use. And going back to the very first page and the first part of this article, what we've already read, but I think is important to emphasize at this point, is that this is one of the reasons why Fuentes sees that as people develop different kinds of tools in different environments and different languages, that human nature is less something that is set in stone for all time, set in stone, set biologically, genetically for all time, that can be transformed in different places so that we see different kinds of potentials for what humans can do, but not necessarily something that is completely hardwired. And so, as we talked about in terms of being able to expand into different territories, culture, learned behavior, being able to transmit that behavior becomes vital to being able to survive and being able to go into different places. So, we see that the stone tools are a good example of why an extended evolutionary synthesis helps us understand or helps us to know better how people are actively involved in their own evolution. All right. Like I said, we've already talked about stone tools, and in some ways, I had originally intended to put that back there, so it's in some ways a review. The second case is that of warfare. And in this case, Fuentes is making an argument against two very deeply rooted ideas that we have about human beings and about the state of nature. So one of those ideas is that warfare is something that is genetic, that it's just what we do and that it's rooted in our biology. And for people who believe this, they'll go back into the primates, the non-human primates and other animals and believe that, animals are all just killing each other. So that's one, the competition idea. So that's one idea. Perhaps linked to that is the idea that people in a state of nature, or people who are hunters and gatherers or foragers, are always fighting each other. And that it is only with the rise of the state and the rise of things like police and government that people are stop fighting each other and they are civilized and pacified. And this idea, both of these ideas, are very deep in European thought. When we were reading Jared Diamond, I mentioned that the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, from about 1550s or so, was the one who said that life for humans in a state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short. And he also said very famously that the life in the state of nature is a war of all against all, the war of every man against every man. And so the idea is that if you leave people to themselves, they're just going to all kill each other. So Fuentes is Fuentes is going to be disputing both of these claims. So in part, it's because he acknowledges that, of course, we're going to find interpersonal or inter-animal violence and even inter-group conflicts, but that they do not meet the definition of human warfare. So one of the first things he does is define warfare, and he says that we don't see that among the non-human animals. Ariana, what is human warfare? What is that based upon, and what do we see when it comes to humans fighting each other in these groups? Okay, so as this is on page 8, humans largely engage in warfare primarily because of perceptions, beliefs, training. That's crucial, right? We actually, today, we still train people to do this, and the role in society they occupy. So it's very unlike non-human animal groups. So when Fuentes says warfare, he says earlier, the most basic definitions of warfare is organized lethal violence by members of one group against members of another group. And we don't see that among non-human animals. We see some intergroup conflict, but we don't see this organized lethal violence. The other point that he makes, which is kind of perhaps subtle, is on page 9 that it would be difficult to explain warfare in a natural selection or a direct selection model. He says that there is little, none, or a negative correlation between participation in warfare and fitness. Now, we might just pause here and think about this. It's actually probably pretty easy to figure this one out. If I am a person who is given to wanting to fight people and wanting to go to war, what is the most likely outcome for me? Yes. The most likely outcome for me is my own death. And that's why it's difficult to figure out how this could be a natural selection advantage. When you remember, right, evolution has the idea that you pass along your traits. The more you can reproduce, the better off you are. The earlier you die, the less able you are to have offspring to pass along traits. So it's difficult to get to propensity for violence as in, oh, well, that will help these creatures reproduce. Usually the persons who are the most violent are the most likely to die. So it's difficult to explain that by natural selection. Now, I also want to pause here and ask about those chimpanzees. Because from early on, from some of Jane Goodall's research among chimpanzee groups and some others, there are some interesting things that chimpanzees do that look a lot like warfare in certain situations. Agustín Fuentes is actually a primatologist himself, so he does know this literature and some of the debate. His own perspective, he writes here, is that some, but not all, communities of chimpanzees engage in border patrols and occasional intergroup lethal attacks. So some of the chimpanzee groups do something where they kind of walk along behind each other and regularly patrol something that looks like a border and then sometimes attack other groups. However, there remains much contention about the nature and structure of the coordination, the premeditation, and the patterns of occurrence across chimpanzee distribution of such behavior. So what he's saying there is that, yes, have been these observations which some people have termed warfare, because you see this in this border patrols and intergroup lethal attacks, but there's a lot of debate about how much of that is actually premeditated, organized, trained for, etc. Even if we're going to say, all right, fine, that's warfare, we'll just call it warfare because it looks pretty much like what humans do. I would say a few things about it. As Fuentes says, this is the case among some groups of chimpanzees, but certainly not all groups of chimpanzees. So it's not a species-wide characteristic. The examples that I know about best, and I'm not a primatologist, but the examples that I've seen exhibited this are often in cases where the chimpanzee habitat has been pushed back because of basically humans' expansion, and places in which the humans and chimpanzees have been in a lot of contact. And this goes back to Jane Goodall's original research. Goodall herself says that if she had to do it again, she wouldn't have set up a situation in which the chimpanzees were able to come in to the field station and eat there, and one of them got a hold of a gasoline tin and was rolling it around the jungle, and then rose to the top of the chimpanzee hierarchy because he was able to, roll this gasoline can around and make a lot of noise. So those kinds of things, some of the observations here, you have to be a little bit like, well, would that have happened outside of this kind of extensive human contact? Not all of these, but some of the big examples of this. And then, of course, the other thing is we have, to my knowledge, not observed similar behavior, intergroup lethal violence. In fact, we haven't actually observed lethal violence among bonobo populations, which are, as we've talked about, equidistant from human beings. So my feeling is that, I agree with Fuentes that, I don't know if we should even call what the chimpanzees are doing warfare, but if we wanted to, fine. But then there'd still be these caveats that what it does not mean, going back to our original ideas, is that warfare is somehow genetic or cannot be separated from the human species, that we got it through an evolutionary natural selection. So we'll rule that one out. Now, the second argument that the creatures in a state of nature are always fighting each other can basically be ruled out by looking at the archaeological record. When we look at the history of bipedalism, hominins, the creatures that were prior to the Homo species, we see some instances of violence, but certainly no intergroup lethal violence. So we don't see any evidence of hominin warfare. And we don't see much evidence of warfare in foraging or hunting and gathering societies. And so it seems to be that for, well, this is actually on page 8, for approximately 98% of the fossil evidence for the genus Homo between approximately 2 million years ago and approximately 15,000 years ago show no sign of traumatic lethal violence. So most of the time, we don't see even any lethal violence. The violence that we see seems to be between individuals and not group level intergroup lethal violence. And so the idea that humans and hominins and creatures in a state of nature are always fighting each other and takes the state to keep them separate can also be ruled out. Now, that said, there is evidence does emerge for warfare in the archaeological record. So we do want to be clear that we both see there's a whole long time period where we don't see any evidence for warfare, but then there's a time period in which we do see evidence for warfare. So some people have gone back to the pre-time and say, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is to say, oh, just because we don't find it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It must have been there. But in this case, we do find it. We find clear evidence of warfare at certain periods, and before that, we don't. And we don't see much evidence of it until about before 7,500 years ago. It's very rare that you'll see any signs of intergroup lethal violence. But from that point on, and especially in that period of 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, you see this kind of increases in the scale, amount, and duration of intergroup lethal violence. Christine, what's going on during this time? What's happening? changes in status, riches, and power, and ideas, the food surplus, and this idea of property, right? Having stuff, being able to hold on to things, store food, have it, and have a territory over which you have control and are able to store the food. So it seems to emerge with not with the hunting and gathering populations, as we talked about, those they would just move along. No reason to really engage in much intergroup warfare. You just go to a different place. But it really starts to intensify with an agricultural production, the kinds of things that we talked about in the last class about walls, boundaries, borders, being able to support a standing army, and ideas about the group that your group is kind of the in group and the out group is the enemy. Now, Cass, I know you got a little bit depressed about the idea of community here and it's being marshaled in order to fight other people. And it is true that sometimes the idea of an us can be turned against other people, and it's not so nice when it is. I would say here that that the idea of community as an us is fine as long as there's not leaders who are trying to exploit it and trying to turn people against others. So you can have an us. It's the them that is the problem. So this is on page 10. Humans made the mental shift from individual on individual violence, which has always been a part of our lives. People fighting other people for various things and reasons or just because they're mad at them, to the possibility of perceiving another group as the enemy, creatively dehumanizing them. So coming up with ways to figure out why the enemy should not be considered human and thus can be attacked, not because of a specific individual thing that anybody did, but just because they belonged to another group. So I would say the problem is not necessarily the notion of an us, it's the notion of a them out there and people who are able to exploit those ideas because they're going to benefit from them. I would also say that even in today's world where we know we have armies and we know very well how to train people to do these things, we really have to train people to do this. And even the people who are trained to hurt other people are not, they don't necessarily, they often desert, or they often don't want to do what that. So it's something that has to be built into people. Why does this matter to us? The so what? The so what question is that in some ways, I hope that the end point of this article is not depressing, but actually helps us to know that although we do see a lot of bad stuff in the world and it's sad and terrible, that much of the story of human history is of the possibility of people being able to peacefully cooperate and get along. And so we can be confident that there is not some sort of inbuilt genetic basis or natural biological thing that is making people do bad things or fighting each other. And that we have lots and lots of examples, and we could still have peaceful societies and people who cooperate and trade and interact. And sure, there's going to be violence and bad individuals all the time, but that you can have a peaceful society without necessarily having an organized police force or an army trying to keep everybody down. Life in a state of nature is really not the war of all against all. It's actually one of people talking, cooperating, making tools together, doing scaffolded learning,